Good morning. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. So please take your seat, and our lovely Olga Visa will be up right now. Wow. That's to all of you. Thank you. I love seeing all this energy and excitement in the room. So good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Bienvenidos a todos to the Phoenix Art Museum on this beautiful late September morning. It's really wonderful to have you all with us today for today's program, both those of you who are here in the room with us and those who are watching online. So it's great that we're able to webcast this for others to join. So thank you again for joining us. I'm Olga Viso. I'm the Seelig Family Chief Curator and Director of Curatorial Affairs here at the Phoenix Art Museum. And on behalf of myself, our director, Jeremy Mikulezak, the staff here at the Phoenix Art Museum, and of course, our wonderful and amazing Christian Ramirez. Big, big, big round of applause. Resounding pleasure to welcome you here. And Christian, as many of you know, is our Assistant Curator for Contemporary Art and Director of Engagement. And she worked very closely with Dr. Matthew Sandoval. Another big round of applause for Matthew. He's had a big grin on his face, like for weeks and weeks and months. So, and very excited to be here in this moment. And Matthew is the Associate Professor of Cultural Studies and Dean's Fellow for Access and Inclusive Excellence at Arizona State University's Barrett Honors College. And so, welcome again to both of you, and really to thank you for the work that you've been doing really over the last year and even longer. I mean, this has been something that's building for a long time. To organize today's symposium, they have a great program in store for you. Want to also welcome all the speakers. We have 14 people coming from out of town to join this event in the program. And a special, special warm thanks to Amalia Mesa-Baines, who will be offering our keynote speech today to kick us off, and she'll be doing it virtually. And Amalia, just to say thank you for your participation and presence. It's so, so meaningful to all of us, as it was hosting Amalia's major survey organized by the Berkeley Art Museum that was here 2 Novembers ago. And as a side note, we're excited that we will be installing late this November Amalia's Queen of the Waters installation from the early 90s in the permanent collections of the Phoenix Art Museum. Christian's momentarily going to be offering the kind of run of the day and the program with Matthew, but I just wanted to just offer a few words just to underscore how very excited all of us at the Phoenix Art Museum are about hosting today's symposium, but also to be supporting the essential research that Christian and Matthew, together with Annie Lopez and Dr. Anita Huizar Hernandez, have been leading over the last year. And it is all going to culminate in a major exhibition that we are planning for 2028. That will be accompanied by a publication also published by the Phoenix Art Museum. So today is just one in what we hope will be the first of what will be many more moments of recognition, of acknowledgement, of coming together, of retrospective reflection, which is so important, to acknowledge the singular accomplishments and contributions of MARS, El Movimiento Artístico del Río Salado, the Phoenix-based arts collective and gallery established in 1978 by Robert Buitron, Liz Lerma. Everybody gets an applause. Ed Diaz, Manuel Acuña, Armando Hernandez, William Galindo, Jose Andres Giron, Jem Covarrubias, Francisco Zuniga. MARS to serve local Chicano and indigenous artists. There's no question that the contribution of MARS was significant and wide-reaching. Active for some 25 years, MARS organized critical exhibitions such as Rascuachismo, Chicano Aesthetics in 1988, Post-Chicano Generation in Art and Breaking Boundaries in 1990, Counter-Colonialismo, 1991, 92, and the list goes on and on. Also created youth programs, the Summer Youth Employment and Cultural Program, which employed Mars and other artists to conduct workshops at the Mars Gallery, and hosted a visiting artist series with artists including Amalia, Luis Jimenez, Carmen Lomas Garza, Cesar Martinez, Judy Baca, and many, many more. These programs engaged young people and attracted Latinx and indigenous artists from the US and Mexico. And as everyone knows in this room, this is a long overdue moment of recognition and acknowledgement here in Phoenix, at the Phoenix Art Museum, and at cultural institutions in our state and museums across the country. Although there have been a number of retrospective exhibitions that have looked at other regional Chicano arts organizations, such as Self-Help Graphics in Los Angeles, Galeria de la Raza in San Francisco, and Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center in San Antonio, Mars has yet to receive the scholarly attention and recognition that it deserves, and it remains underrepresented in the narrative of art history, and remains, needing deep research and understanding and acknowledgement of its important contributions. So this symposium is the first step in that essential corrective.
Recording in progress. Recording stopped.
Just not early enough, but it's starting now, right? And again, leading up to the museum exhibition and publication, and we hope that exhibition will tour. We'll make every effort, to really share this research and coming together far and wide. There are many people to thank. I've already mentioned Christian, who proposed and championed this research and recognition really since the moment she came on board here as curator at the Phoenix Art Museum some 3 years ago. And Christian also runs our Arizona Artist Awards program, which is really a cornerstone of her curatorial work here. And I'll let Christian tell the story of how this research emerged out of research she was doing on another exhibition. Matthew Sandoval, who's been just a generous collaborator and contributor, an important historian for the project, and a great partner to Christian, who just brings that equal passion and commitment to correcting art history. Symposium Advisory Committee members Annie Lopez, who's been just a gracious connector and historian for the project. Dr. Anita Huizar Hernandez, an essential sounding board and collaborator to Christian and Matthew. India Stewart, our curatorial administrator. Tiffany Lippincott, who's here keeping us on point with the program, is our MAP curator of engagement and works closely with Christian to organize programming throughout the year. Kristen Kevershan, who's our special events manager, and our AV technician, Alan Plascencia, they've just been behind the scenes organizing today's events. Finally, we're grateful to the funders who've helped support this project in its early phases of development in today's symposium, the Arizona Community Foundation, and I want to thank Adam Lopez Falk, in particular, who's nonprofit engagement officer at the Arizona Community Foundation, for his support and patronage of this. And thank you to the Arizona Community Foundation, which also supports our Pay What You Wish Wednesdays and First Friday programs that provide access to the museum for our community and to more rural partners of our state to come to the Phoenix Art Museum. And also for contributing funds to be presenting sponsor to support the exhibition, the first sponsor to come on board to support that effort and publication that will come out of this body of research that's generated from the symposium. Thanks as well to the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, who've supported research for this exhibition. Christian received a planning grant, a curatorial research fellowship from the Warhol Foundation to do this in the spring of '25. And thank you to the Terra Foundation for American Art, whose convening grants supports the symposium today as well. So I want to turn it over now to Christian and Matthew to kick us off for the day. And just, again, thank you so much for being here and for being great partners with us in this important research that we're kicking off this weekend. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here today. The day has finally come. We've been working on this for what feels like forever, so it's amazing to actually see all of the people I've only known on Zoom screens in person. It's amazing. So as Olga said, I'm Christian Ramirez. I am the Con Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art and Director of Engagement at Phoenix Art Museum, and I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Professor Muerte aka Matthew Sandoval, in organizing today's symposium. This couldn't have happened without the sponsors that Olga has mentioned, as well as our incredible community partners, the ASU Hispanic Research Center, Cultural Coalition, Chico, the Sagrado, and Cala Alliance. Thank you so much for your support in this process. An extra big thank you to our advisory committee, Annie and Anita. You guys have been absolutely amazing to work with and supporting us through the initial brainstorms and trying to figure out what makes sense and how to do it. So thank you so much for your partnership with this. And we'd also like to take a moment to recognize all the Mars artists that are in attendance today. So if you are, please stand and be recognized for your incredible contributions to American art. So I first fell into this project as I was preparing to be the coordinating curator for Phoenix's presentation of Amalia Mesa-Baines' Archaeology of Memory, curated by Laura E. Perez and Maria Esther Fernandez. As I was reading the exhibition catalog, which is still available in the museum store, so make a little stop on your way out, and I saw in the back of the catalog there's a chronology, and listed in there was that she had her first solo exhibition in Arizona was in 1990 at Movimiento Artístico de Río Salado Art Space. I had no idea what that was. So I started Googling, trying to figure out what it was. You know, I grew up in Tucson. I went to art school at the University of Arizona. I'd been active in the arts community for over 15 years in Arizona, and I just did not know what this was. So through research, through enlisting the help of our incredible archivist, Aspen Reynolds, she pulled a couple boxes of ephemera that had been donated by Clayton Kirk and Annie Lopez. So that's kind of how I began connecting with Mars artists and figuring out what this was and really the importance and significance of the work that they had contributed. And it was really the Rascuachismo essay and exhibition that was my holy cow, how has not more been done for this group of people who have contributed so much to not just Phoenix's art community or Arizona's art community, but nationally. It is an important institution in the American art canon. So I was lucky enough to find the best collaborator I could have in Matthew. So thank you to Matthew for being down to take on this beast of a project. It's been amazing to have you as my partner. Thank you to Jeremy Mikolajczak and Olga Viso for championing the symposium, as well as the forthcoming exhibition and publications. Thank you to my amazing colleagues who've worked so hard to cross the T's and dot the I's. I always get them backwards. To pull off this event of such magnitude. Thank you to the Mars artists and board members who have been so generous with their time and trusting us with your memories. Thank you to the brilliant panelists. It's been amazing to have you all here, to be here for the very first and hopefully not last Mars Symposium. And then an extra big thank you to Melissa San Miguel for creating the chronology in the catalog of Amalia Mesa-Baines, because without her research, I don't know how long it would have taken to make sure that Mars got this long overdue shine. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Phoenix Art Museum for inviting me into this project. 2 years ago, we started kicking ideas around for a symposium dedicated to a local group / loco group of multidisciplinary artists who called themselves Movimiento Artístico de Río Salado. A group loco enough to name themselves after the life-giving force that made Phoenix possible. A group loco enough to create their own alternative art space. A group loco enough to dedicate themselves to promoting Chicano art and culture. A group loco enough to believe they could impact, enlighten, and empower their community. Ideas that were so out of this world that the group had to be called Mars. After 2 years of planning, prepping, and hard work, today we get to revisit Mars to celebrate and investigate this local group of Rascuaches. In all honesty, 2 years ago, I didn't anticipate this symposium would be as important as it is today. Today, when Chicano and Latino history are once again being disappeared, when our contributions to the nation are once again being disappeared, when the bodies of our friends, of our families, of our communities are once again being disappeared. So it means something when we gather today to say our bodies, our contributions, our histories, our stories will not be disappeared because we are here, presente. It means something when a prominent institution like the Phoenix Art Museum also steps up to say presente. And it means something when good folks like you show up to the museum on a Saturday morning to say presente. Today we have some of the dopest artists, art historians, art curators, and cultural scholars from across the nation to help us revisit Mars. So huge thank you to our panelists for being here to drop knowledge today. Huge thanks to Tiffany Lippincott for helping us make this happen, to India, to Alan up there running this whole show. Thank you to everyone attending in person and virtually. It means a lot. Folks, we have a long day of learning ahead. So let's get started. We're going to get things kicked off by a little keynote from the maestra, the madrina, the icon, Amalia Mesa-Baines. So we're just going to kick it over to her and get this thing rolling.
Thank you, Matthew. It's very energizing to hear you talk.
You're not up on the screen.
Oh.
Yeah.
Can you all hear me? Hope so. I'm very excited to be with you today and very grateful to Christiane, Olga, and Matthew for starting us off and giving us this space. Like many of my generation, I am a product of a community-based organization. In my case, it was the Galería de la Raza. But Mars was always there for us, like many others, and I want to talk today about the importance of Mars as a space for innovation and experimentation, and also how welcoming it was for many of us who came from other places. I'm using the arrow and I'm using the space bar, and it's not moving.
Oh, no. No, it's right.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So I'll start again. I'm really happy to be here. I've had a long history of working in community organizations from basically California through to Chicago. And when I came to Mars, I understood it as one of our casas de cultura. And like many of the other institutions in which Chicanos networked, it was an incubator for us. For example, my home base was Galería Raza. But as you can see from the list on the screen, these spaces were responses to inclusion, and they were formed in an era in the first generation of Chicano art, where people were trying to make casas de cultura that were anti-elite, that provided a space for the kind of regional differences and needs. They addressed social justice issues, land rights, bilingualism, indigeneity, spirituality, and feminism. They provided community programs of service through education, cultural ceremony, and political organizing. They also served as networks for different groups and different artists. And I met Roberto Bitron and Liz Lerma in the days of Ixte and Popo when they did performance art. And one of my oldest relationships is with Liz Lerma, my comadre, for decades now. And so I'm very excited to talk about Mars and the way in which they exchanged with those of us coming from California and other parts of the Southwest. What you're looking at now is the work of Rupert Garcia. So along the years of travel and exchange, Mars developed a print series. So Rupert, Patsy Valdez, and work from OSCO made its way to Mars. Over that time, I was invited eventually to come to Mars to create work that was part of a larger Chicano aesthetic. And I want to talk about that aesthetic. There's been references to it from the statements that both Christian and Matthew made about the locos, about the rascuachistas, and all that came with that. It was these spaces that allowed artists to experiment, and through that developed an aesthetic that was in the fertile ground of these organizations. It played a great part, they played a great part in the founding of Chicano art. The strategies of cultural reclamation, resistance and affirmation, rascuachismo, and even what I learned later about women's work in rascuachismo that I coded as domesticana. And continue the work of Patsy Valdez. And then in 1990, Liz and I believe someone else, Rudy, I think, was there at the time, Google him, and they invited me to participate in what was then a widespread movement of the counter-quincentennial. This was 1990 in the run-up to the 1992 quincentennial. We were very lucky. We had a mole at the Smithsonian. Alicia Gonzalez let us know the kinds of rather mainstream and I say colonial dominant activities that the Smithsonian would engage in. And so across the Southwest and even into Chicago, organizations determined that they would counter the quincentennial and host a very large selection of exhibitions, poster brigades, colloquia. And so I came to Mars in 1990 to do a piece called Undiscovering America, a counter-quincentennial celebration. I was working at that time with Victor Zamudio Taylor, who was of Pi descent, a very important scholar, then based at Princeton, who shared with me his understanding of the colonial moment the Spanish invaded the Americas. And I use the word invaded because I think discovery is much too benign. He talked about the twin poles of speculare, the Latin word for to see the other, and curiositas, the Latin word to know the other. And so I created two pieces. One of them was the cabinet, curiositas, the cabinet. And one of the most exciting parts of working in Mars is that at that time it had the largest flea market in the world. At least that's how it was advertised. And so Victor and I spent many, many days scouring the flea market, finding all kinds of tools and weapons and realia that could be used as an indicator of the suffering that was brought by the Spanish into the Americas. So the chair is my autopsy chair. The cabinet, and I believe it may have a close-up of it, had in fact everything from bear traps to surgical tools and dental tools and objects from botanicas, all kinds of healing methodologies, and most of all, signs of our existence. That's one of the things that I agree so wholeheartedly with Matthew about what you're doing today. This is a dark time. It is a time when we're being desaparecidos, and I think it's really important to set the record straight, to go back to the times and then go forward to the future, acknowledging what we've done and why we've done it. And so for me, speculare and curiosidad were two very, very important elements in the work that I was doing. I treated it as a residency, and it was for me a chance to experiment with a new form. And I want to say that this may have happened with many other artists, but I know it was for me a life-changing moment because Mars allowed me to find my way from just doing altars and ofrendas into the idea of laboratories and libraries. And so my first laboratory was based on the Cabinet of Curiosities, the 18th and 19th century phenomena in which colonial exploration misdirected, distorted, and misunderstood who we were because they came with their own fantasies and ideas about this so-called new world. So the cabinet was my attempt to start a very simple cabinet of curiosities. I was able to borrow a cabinet. I think it was either from Liz's house or someone else's. We found an old rug. I found an old chair at the flea market. I spent many, many nights in my hotel. It was actually a motel, and I was cutting up the chair and sewing it back together in the style of an autopsy. It began for me the attempt to really understand that colonial moment. So below the cabinet and on the ground are a series of religious figures because the Catholicism that came with the military forts that made the missions in California and Texas and even some in New Mexico were really a twin exploration into that world. Speculare was much harder to do. I didn't have a real laboratory, so I created one. Mars had this window case or a wall case, and so I used it to explore the issues of the indigenous groups that had lived there before, looking at the exploitation of Mexican food, looking specifically at those religious imagery that had been part of my life. And so these works were really the beginning of the examination of scientific racism. In this case, you can see that I've put together in a very Rasquatch style the laboratory. We borrowed a telescope from someone. I brought a microscope. We used many of the objects of popular culture, posters, food signs, designs that we thought were also a way of talking about how we existed and how we were distorted. So that colonial age, which led to the bifurcation of the museum from the Museum of Europe to the Hall of Man, was the beginning, I think, of the misunderstanding of who we were. And it was only in the contemporary age when Chicanos and Latinos and other people of color came into the modern museum that we see the contrast between the idea of the museum, the masterpiece, and the artist, and then in the Hall of Man, the ethnic artifact and the anonymous artisan. But we were both because we had been raised in the United States and we had a heritage from both sides. So the laboratory was my attempt to try to talk about scientific racism, the way we had been replaced and distorted within the values of the museum world. So the system that we're talking about is also the basis of folk and fine. When we start to look at museums now and how they operate, we begin to see really how those distortions have lasted. So being able to go back and look at the history of places like Mars, the Galeria de la Raza, is our attempt to begin to explore the reality of true American art. So this laboratory was the beginning of some of the other pieces that came about later. In that same year, in 1990, I went to the Museo del Barrio. I went to the Harlem Museum, and I went to a number of other places during the Decade Show. And at that point, the cabinet turned into the dresser because I was talking about home place. So what you're looking at now is the dresser from Borders, Emblems of the Decade. And so I took the form of the emblem that, once again, Victor Zamudio Taylor had shared with me. And emblemaries were moral teaching. So they had an inscriptio, that's my borders. They had a pictoria, which is the installation itself, and they had a subscriptio. And in this particular piece, I am quoting from the stories from the schoolhouse border, crossing the schoolhouse border, which in fact is narratives of young people who cross the border. And I was working in the Unified School District in San Francisco, and this is the story of a young boy who's put in a bag of potatoes in the back of a truck and travels across the border holding a piece of paper that tells him where to meet his mother. But in the process, he loses the paper, and when he's released on the other side safely, people have to help him find his mother. So the idea of displacement, immigration, loss, and grief are all part of this. So by this time, in my traditional style of recycling, the autopsy chair from Mars becomes the autopsy chair in the colonial age of the borders. And Victor and I did the wall together. Both of our families are there. Victor is standing in his crib. And on the wall is the upside down St. Anthony, which is a narrative from Judy Baca about her grandmother for when the boys were off to war. She said that St. Anthony should help find him as he was the patron saint of lost things, but he couldn't find them. And so she locked him in the closet and tied him up and hung him upside down. And every night you could hear the knocking, but she wouldn't let him out until they came home. And so this became part of the narrative. I have letters in a box that people wrote to me about borders. And across from borders and emblems of the decade is numbers. And you can clearly see it is a translation of the laboratory at Mars. This is what I think is so critical about looking at this institution, that it allowed people like me to change the way we work, to experiment with new forms, to expand our vocabulary, to even change the aesthetic that had established us. And so numbers was never done again. I'm hoping I'll be invited in 2028, if I'm still here, to redo numbers for the Mars retrospective. And I use the numbers of historical dates, city populations. This was the era of AIDS, the era of the students of the dropout age. So all of these things, and also many indigenous materials, were used to make numbers turn into a statement about the contemporary life of Latinos. So you can see the polvos from the curandera. You see the stereoptics with scenes from Mexico. You see all the stamps of letters that have been sent to me. And then you see the list of numbers on the ticker tape. Next, the chair and the table and the ticker tape go to Sor Juana's library at Williams College, where we did the second section of the Venus Envy, my private biography or autobiography, and it's called The Harem and Other Closures, because that year in 1993 and 94, I had gone to Istanbul for the second biennial there, and I did another piece, the Borders piece, and I saw the harem. So once again, the table becomes this bricolage of the very same materials expanded that I began in the Mars cabinet. So the cabinet and the laboratory come together in this particular rendering. And for those who don't know, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz was of a 17th century nun, many of whom, many of you who know that she's written. And the Borders piece is at the Flag Museum in New York right now. So the next rendering of this type of library and laboratory takes place in 2000 in my show, The Fin del Siglo, the Latino World's Fair. And this was done at the Bernice Steinbaum Gallery in Miami. And once again, I start looking at the extreme version of distortion that comes with the colonial age, and I start looking at World's Fairs. So I went from the Cabinet of Curiosity, the Wunderkammer, the laboratory, the library, to the World's Fair. And I hung banners in this that were taken from the World's Fair at the De Young Museum in 1894. And so in 1994, they celebrated it, and I saw many of these images. And in my Hall of Science in the background is Perfume Laboratory, looking at the sort of curanderismo and the healing properties. And in that hall are perfume jars that are traveling around in various states and coming to this place as mementos of various women. And what you see in the banner is the actual Hall of Science image of the women of Dahomey in a tent, and they've sprinkled bones on the floor to make them look like cannibals. So World's Fairs operated from the idea of progress and also the savage. So we were always placed in the category of the savage, so that the West could be seen as the scene of civilization and future. And this was the Hall of Fashion, and I have even a picture of Patsy Valdez as a doll. This is the Hall of Science, the Perfume Laboratory. And this merges later, recycled into the Curanderas Botanica, which now belongs to the National Gallery. And that is my grandmother, Mariana Escobedo, in the light box, who was not a curandera, but took my father to curanderas. So the healing traditions become an expansion of the laboratory. And on the bottom layer is the curanderas materials. On the top layer is the Western medical and scientific. And what I tried to do in the cabinet is to layer the 5 shelves with the healing traditions of my own family. There's a layer for my father, my mother, my sister, my brother, and my husband. So these pieces are extensions, really, of that very first, I think, I wouldn't call it humble, but I would say it was a beginning process for me at Mars, where I was allowed to do that kind of work. And you can see that on the table there are writings, and the writings and the Book of Healing are part of my own study, because this particular piece came out of a very serious accident I had in 2003, in which I broke many parts of my body, my neck, my arm, my leg, my elbow, and my ankle, and took 5 years to heal. So this was in the Neo-Hudo Show at the Menil, and traveled to Miami to the, later the Perez Museum, but then the Miami Art Museum. And it is a reflection of how culture moves through our communities, and how these systems and networks of art take us into the stories of our personal narratives and our family lives. And this last image is the image of the New World Wunderkammer. This piece was done in 2013. It took me 2 years to get through this piece, and it was an invitation from the Fowler Museum on their 50th anniversary. And they asked me to come and do an altar, and I said to them, you know, what would be more on target for me is if I could do a Wunderkammer with a Cabinet of Curiosity. And so what I did was I went with my husband, Richard, to several visits, long-term visits at the museum and in their collections. And this particular piece is very important to me personally, because it is based on the mestizaje of Mexico, or the tercer raíz, the African diaspora that is part of our heritage. So on the right is the African section of the cabinet. In the center is the Mesoamerican, and on the left is the colonial. And at the bottom, there are blessing spaces. Carmen Lomas Garza was my guide for the indigenous, as a danzante and a woman of ceremony. And Martha Morena Vega from the Caribbean Cultural Center, who I consider my sister, was my guide for the African diasporic work in the bottom layer of the blessings, because this was a very difficult piece to do. If I had been younger, I probably would have refused to do it. I was still very angry about how our communities were ruptured by the stolen legacies that were brought into European museums. And the man who collected this, Henry Wellcome, was a pharmacist who somehow created the first patent for pills, actual tablets, in Europe in the early 1900s, because until that point, you had to go to the chemist and have drugs mixed. So he started out looking at medical properties and medical imagery all over the world. And from there, he went to wounds and surgery. And from there, he went to war. And all of these pieces come from his collection. And I was lucky enough to work directly with the registrars, the anthropologists, the historians that work at the museum. I never touched any of these pieces because they were not allowed to be touched. And I had been given advice by Martha especially that I should not use any pieces that had dried blood on them. So one of the struggles in doing this piece, which comes directly out of that very, very first simple cabinet curiosity at Mars, was to expand the understanding of the colonial age and the vicious and violent history that undergirds it. So in order to give people the understanding of how this came about, I was allowed, with their help, to photograph each of the guardian figures that are in the archways and in the blessing spaces below, and create for each of them a print. And that print was based on research they gave me and helped me to do. And it had 3 layers, and one layer was the location, where in the world it came from. The second was its utility, its ceremony, and its purpose. And then the third one was the object itself. Often I used maps and other things. So for me, the idea of creating a discourse around colonialism really began for me in the deepest way at Mars Art Space. And I think about this now because when I look in retrospect at the power and the necessity of our community-based arts organizations, I see that the work we did, even when we were beginning, was so very important. And the networks that connected us one to the other built lifelong friendships. My comadre, Liz, and I have known each other even before the 90s. We knew each other in the 80s. I have been close with Carmen Lomas Garza, Judy Baca, Esther Hernandez, Patsy Valdez, the late Patricia Rodriguez, and the late Yolanda Lopez for over 50 years. And so I think the value of this archival work that you're doing is the purpose of memory. Memory is the greatest strategy and tool we have as people of color. To never forget is an act of resistance. To never forget who we are and where we came from. Writers like Walter Benjamin taught us long ago in his philosophical books, Illuminations and others, that our ancestors knew we were coming. They were waiting for us, and our agreement with them can never be settled cheaply. We are the historians that fan the spark of hope and firmly believe that our ancestors will never be safe as long as the enemy wins. And so I think of those words now when I think about the symposium, the impending exhibition, the support of the Phoenix Art Museum, the presence of so many of you here today who lived that history, who are with us now to remember. And in the symposium, I think we are creating an antidote to the new cultural age of amnesia, the censorship, and the mainstream ventriloquists who think they can speak for us. I would like to end with our favorite huelgas. Aquí estamos y no nos vamos. Thank you.